I want to be precise about the sequence of events, because the official record is not. The official record says the Vreth Dominion made first contact with humanity at 3:12 shipboard time on the 14th of March, in the 5th year of the Carrath Passage survey. It says the exchange was initiated by the Dominion's lead vessel, and that hostilities commenced when the Dominion fleet moved into encirclement posture, which is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not say is what I saw in the 47 minutes before that, sitting at my station in the Combat Information Center of the carrier Meridian, watching a sovereign armada arrange itself around us the way a man arranges cutlery before a meal he has not yet decided how to eat. I am Sergeant Analyst Dara Voss. I hold an intelligence billet attached to Fleet Command's Survey and Contact Division. My job, as it was explained to me 3 years earlier when I was reassigned from the 4th Tactical Assessment Group to the Meridian's embedded staff, was to watch, observe, record, correlate, report. I was not a weapons officer. I was not a pilot. I carried a sidearm I had not discharged outside a range in 8 years, and my contribution to any engagement was considered to be informational rather than kinetic. That distinction felt meaningful on the day I was briefed. It felt progressively less so across the 3 weeks of passive observation that preceded the 14th of March, and it felt essentially meaningless at 2:48 shipboard time on the morning itself, when I watched Admiral Cray walk into the CIC and look at the plot and start making decisions that I knew, with the particular clarity of a person whose entire job is the accumulation and assessment of information, were the right ones. Let me tell you about the Carrath Passage first, because the geography matters. The passage is a corridor of navigable space, approximately 400 light-years in length and roughly 40 light-years across at its widest point, running between the outer edge of what we then called the Kessler boundary, the frontier of reliably charted human space, and a region of dense nebular material that our astronomers had been cataloging for 60 years, but that nobody had successfully navigated through. The passage was not a natural feature in any traditional sense. It was simply an absence, a region of space that happened to be clear of the dust concentrations and gravitational anomalies that made the surrounding areas difficult for long-range navigation. It was the kind of place that, in an earlier era of human exploration, would have been called a sea lane, a reliable path between 2 points, useful to anyone who needed to move large things over large distances, and therefore contested real estate the moment more than one party knew it existed. We had known about the passage for 11 years before the Meridian group was dispatched there. We had known that the Vreth Dominion was using it for at least 6 of those 11 years, because our long-range sensor arrays at the Kessler boundary had been detecting transit signatures consistent with large-mass interstellar vessels moving through the outer passage corridor for that entire period. What we had not known, what the Meridian group had been specifically tasked to determine, was the scope and nature of the Dominion's presence, their capability profile, their territorial disposition relative to charted human space, and their likely response to confirmed contact with a human survey element. The answer to that last question turned out to be more specific than we had anticipated. I had been on the Meridian for 26 months when the observation phase of the mission began in earnest, and the first 8 months of that had been routine survey work of the kind that sounds exciting in the recruitment materials, and is, in practice, a great deal of careful cataloging interrupted by longer periods of cautious waiting. The Meridian was a fleet carrier, 2,200 meters from her armored bow to the engine manifolds at her stern, carrying a standard complement of 142 fighter and attack craft in her main bays, with a crew of just under 3,000 including flight personnel, support staff, and the assorted specialists like me who occupied the peripheral billets of a ship that was designed to be, in the language of the fleet's asset classification system, a mobile combined arms platform. She was not a survey vessel. She had the sensors for survey work, because all ships of her class were equipped for extended independent operation. But her design mandate was combat projection, and her profile reflected that. She was armored heavily along her center line and dorsal surface. Her point defense coverage was dense and overlapping, and her main battery of 6 heavy plasma emplacements was positioned for maximum fire arc along her forward quadrant. The Meridian had been sent to the Carrath Passage because the Fleet's Assessment Division had concluded, 6 months before the mission was authorized, that the Vreth Dominion's transit patterns through the passage indicated a power that was expanding, organized, and moving in a direction that would eventually bring it into contact with human-occupied space, whether we sought that contact or not. The choice was between making that contact on our terms with a capable fleet asset, in a location we had spent 16 months mapping, with intelligence officers who had been studying Vreth communication patterns for as long as we'd been in the passage, or waiting for it to happen on their terms, somewhere closer to home, with less preparation. The Fleet's Assessment Division chose the former, and so the Meridian and her 11 companion vessels were dispatched to the outer passage with orders that were, in their essentials, quite simple. Find the Vreth, watch them, learn what you can, and if contact becomes unavoidable, do not embarrass us. I had read those orders several times before I fully appreciated the particular weight of that last phrase. Do not embarrass us. It is the kind of language that, in a civilian context, sounds bureaucratic and self-protective, an institution covering itself against reputational risk. In a military context, in a mission like ours, it meant something more specific. It meant, whatever happens out there, make sure the galaxy's first impression of humanity is not one it will immediately try to improve upon. We had been in passive observation mode for 3 weeks when the Vreth formation began its approach. 3 weeks of running silent, minimal active emissions, engines at station keeping, all 12 ships holding position in a loose formation at the edge of a debris field that the Meridian's navigators had selected, because it provided passive electromagnetic cover, and because it was positioned at an angle to the main Vreth transit corridor that allowed us to observe without being obviously present. 3 weeks of watching, and the picture that emerged from those 3 weeks was one that I logged in my nightly intelligence reports with increasing attention, and, I will admit, increasing personal concern. The Vreth Dominion was not a frontier power. That was the first and most important thing to establish, and it took me approximately 8 days of observation to establish it to my own satisfaction, and another 3 to document it, in a form that would hold up to analytical scrutiny. A frontier power, an expanding civilization at the edge of its own range, stretching itself thin, dependent on long supply lines, and operating with forces that are impressive in aggregate but dispersed across too much territory to concentrate effectively, behaves in ways that a trained intelligence analyst can recognize. Their transit patterns are efficient but not redundant. Their formations are sized to the minimum necessary for the task at hand. Their communication traffic reflects the particular pressure of organizations that are trying to do too many things with too few resources. The Vreth showed none of this. Their transit patterns were redundant in the way that only mature, well-resourced logistical networks can afford to be. Their formations, even in routine transit, were oversized by the standards of any frontier operation. Their communication traffic, which our analysts had been parsing for 3 weeks with growing fluency, was dense, precise, and layered in a way that suggested not an expanding frontier operation, but a well-established administrative apparatus running on established protocols that had been refined over a very long time. They were not at the edge of what they could do. They were operating comfortably within it. The second thing I established, which I documented carefully and which I was careful to present to Admiral Cray in the most measured language I could manage, was the formation count. Petrov had put it at 60+ in his first assessment, early in the second week. By the end of the third week, After we had been tracking transit signatures and formation patterns continuously for 21 days, the number we were working with was 83 vessels confirmed, and an additional unknown number operating beyond the reliable range of our passive sensors. These were not all frontline combat vessels. Our analysis identified probable logistics ships, what appeared to be dedicated communications relay platforms, and at least 2 vessels whose emission signatures were consistent with command and control functions rather than direct combat capability. But even discounting the support elements and the probable noncombatants, the Vreth formation that was moving toward an encirclement posture in the last 72 hours before the 14th represented a combat force that was larger, by ship count, than anything the Meridian group could match. Admiral Cray received my final pre-contact intelligence summary at 2100 on the 13th. She read it in her briefing room with me and Petrov and her chief tactical officer, Commander Rains, present. She asked 3 questions. The first was about the reliability of the formation count. The second was about our assessment of Vreth weapons yield, which Petrov addressed from the spectral analysis of their active emission signatures. The third was about the Vreth communication pattern in the 12 hours preceding their approach. Specifically, whether we had detected anything consistent with negotiation traffic or diplomatic protocol preparation. I told her that we had not. The communication traffic we were seeing was tactical and administrative. There was no pattern in it consistent with the kind of diplomatic preparation that a power conducting a formal first contact approach would typically display. I told her that the formation posture was consistent with what our analysis of long-range Vreth observation had led us to classify as an integration approach, which was the term our analysts had coined, based on observed behavior patterns over 3 weeks, for the particular formation and movement signature that the Dominion appeared to use when it was moving to establish definitive presence in a corridor. Integration approach in our working vocabulary meant, they have decided you are here, they have decided what you are, and they are coming to make that official. Admiral Cray nodded. She thanked us and dismissed us. At 2:15 the next morning, I was at my station in the CIC when the watch officer noted that Contact Alpha, which was how we had been designating the Vreth lead vessel for 3 weeks, had begun an approach bearing change that brought it onto a direct heading for the Meridian group's position. At 2:48, Admiral Cray entered the CIC. I had served with her for 2 years by then. I had seen her in exercises and in the mundane operational routine of a fleet carrier running an extended survey mission, and I had assembled, through observation and through the reading of her service record, and through the particular kind of analytical attention that is an intelligence officer's professional habit, a reasonably complete picture of who she was. She was 61 years old. She had come up through destroyer commands, which in the fleet tended to produce officers with a preference for directness and a low tolerance for operational ambiguity. She had commanded a destroyer group in the Third Passage incident 11 years earlier, which was the last time a human fleet had exchanged fire with a non-human force, and the conduct of her force in that engagement, the specific decisions she had made under pressure, the outcomes those decisions had produced, the casualties she had taken and the ones she had avoided, was documented in the fleet's engagement analysis library in a form that I had read carefully, and that told me more about her than anything else could have. She had taken fire and returned it and held her formation and brought her ships home, and she had done it in a way that the analysis classified as characterized by unusual operational composure under conditions of significant force disparity. That was the clinical summary. What it meant in practical terms was that she had been here before, not here specifically, not the Carrath Passage, not the Vreth Dominion, not 83 vessels against 12, but here in the sense that mattered, at the point where the numbers did not add up in your favor and the decision about what to do anyway had to be made by someone, and that someone was her. She walked into the CIC at 2:48, and she looked at the plot for approximately 15 seconds. The plot showed Contact Alpha on its approach bearing, the 11 encirclement vessels behind it in their wedge formation, and the 6 command and control ships holding at distance. The numbers in the corner of the display showed the current count, 83 confirmed. Our own formation showed at the center of the plot 12 vessels, tight, holding position in the debris field. She said to the room generally that she wanted combat stations. She said she wanted firing solutions on the Vreth command vessels, the 6 at distance, priority 1 through 6 in order of estimated communication centrality. She said she wanted the escort destroyers on point defense posture. She said she wanted 2 full wings armed, staged, and warm on the flight deck, but not launched, not yet. She said she wanted the patrol cruisers on formation Delta 3. And she said she wanted the communication system recording all Vreth transmissions with continuous translation processing running in parallel. She said all of this in the specific tone of a person who has thought about what needs to happen and is now simply telling other people to make it happen. Not elevated, not tight with the effort of containing something, just clear. I was annotating my intelligence record in the moment, which was my function, and I want to be accurate about what I observed in the next 47 minutes, because there has been some discussion in the subsequent official assessments of what the atmosphere in the CIC was during the period before the Vreth Directive arrived, and I think the official assessments tend toward a kind of retroactive narrative tidiness that the actual experience did not have. The CIC of the Meridian was not calm in those 47 minutes. It was professional, which is different. There were 50 officers in that space running their stations with the focused efficiency that 2 years of intensive operational preparation produces. And from the perspective of any external observer, it would have appeared organized and controlled and purposeful. But I was sitting in that room and I was watching faces as well as displays. And what I saw in faces was something more complicated than calm. It was the particular quality that I have thought about many times since, and that I have consistently struggled to describe in my intelligence reports, because it is not a thing that has a clean analytical vocabulary. The quality of a person who has done all the preparation there is to do, and has now arrived at the point where preparation ends and reality begins, and who is holding themselves precisely at that boundary. There was fear in that room. I will say so plainly, because I think the official record's avoidance of that word does a disservice to the people who were present. 83 vessels against 12 is a number that produces fear in a rational person, and the officers of the Meridian were rational people who could read a tactical plot. But there was something else in that room that I have thought about more than the fear, and that I believe matters more for the historical record. There was no hesitation. Not from Admiral Cray, not from Commander Rains at the tactical console, not from Petrov at the intelligence display, not from the communications team running their translation processors, not from the weapons officers confirming their solutions on the 6 priority targets. Whatever those people felt in those 47 minutes, it did not translate into uncertainty about what they were doing or why. The Vreth Integration Directive arrived at 3:12 shipboard time, which was 8 minutes before what our tactical analysis had estimated as the point at which the Vreth formation would complete its encirclement. It came in on the contact frequency our survey team had identified 3 weeks earlier, and it was in a format that our language models had been specifically prepared to parse. Lieutenant Farr, who ran the translation desk and who had been working for 16 hours at that point, had the core substance available within 4 minutes of transmission. The directive was, in structure, a document of considerable bureaucratic precision. It identified the human vessels as an unregistered species operating within Dominion-designated transit space, not Dominion territory proper, but the passage, which the directive described in terms that suggested the Dominion regarded it as an exclusive operational corridor. It enumerated the terms of what it called integration, which were an immediate cessation of independent military operation, a disclosure of home system coordinates and population figures, a transfer of resource sovereignty to Dominion administration pending a formal assessment of species viability, and an acknowledgement that the Dominion's fleet presence in the region constituted lawful authority over all transit operations within the corridor. The directive then listed, in a section that Farr translated with particular care because its phrasing was unusually specific, the precedents for this process. It stated that 41 previous species contacts had resulted in successful integration under this protocol. It stated that in each case, the contacted species had reviewed the Dominion's fleet presence and determined compliance to be the appropriate response. It stated that the compliance window for the current contact was 60 hours, after which the integration process would become operative regardless of response. And it ended with a passage that I want to quote as precisely as our translation allows, because I think it is the passage that tells you the most about the Vreth Dominion and about what happened next. The passage said, in Farr's rendering, "This determination is final. The fleet you see represents standard integration force. Your assessment of this force should produce the same result it has produced in every prior contact. We expect your compliance." We expect your compliance. Admiral Cray stood at the main tactical display while Farr read the translation. She stood there in the silence that followed it with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the plot, at the 83 vessel formation, at the encirclement geometry, at the 6 command vessels that had firing solutions on them and did not know it. She looked at that plot for a period that I timed at 22 seconds. Then she said, "Open the channel," and when communications confirmed the channel was open, she said, "This is the carrier Meridian, commanding officer of Terran Fleet Survey Group 7. Your directive has been received. I am transmitting our response now." And she turned to weapons and said, "Full yield, priority targets on my authorization." And she turned to the flight deck officer and said, "Launch." I have been asked many times, in the 40 years since the engagement in the Carrath Passage, what the room was like in the 2 seconds between Admiral Cray's orders and the first weapons discharge. I have been asked this by intelligence analysts, by historians, by people writing accounts of the engagement who want what they call color, the texture of the moment, the thing that makes it real rather than a notation in a tactical record. I have tried to answer this question honestly, and I have consistently found that my answer sounds either too dramatic or not dramatic enough, depending on who is asking. What I can say is this. The Meridian CIC was a room of approximately 400 square meters, with overhead lighting that ran at operational levels, not the redshift of combat stations, which the Admiral had not ordered, but the standard white working light that made every surface clear and every face readable. The tactical display occupied the central space, a 3-dimensional projection roughly 3 meters across, showing the plot in pale blue notation against a dark field. There were 50 stations ranged around the perimeter and the secondary rows, each one manned, and the sounds of the room were the sounds those stations made in continuous operation. The soft tone sequences of sensor returns, the low murmur of interstation communication, the periodic status calls from the watch officer that had been running every 3 minutes since 2:15. In those 2 seconds, all of that was present, and none of it was what I was aware of. What I was aware of was the particular quality of silence that exists in a large space when every person in it has stopped making incidental noise simultaneously. Not because they were instructed to be silent, but because they were all, at the same moment, attending to the same thing. The main battery was cycling to discharge position. You could feel it in the deck plates if you were paying attention, which everyone was, a deep structural vibration that moved through the ship the way sound moves through water, pervasive and directional at once. It had a specific rhythm, that cycle, one I had heard in exercises and drills, and had noted in my intelligence records as a datum without fully registering its quality. In those 2 seconds, In the operational silence of the CIC, I registered it. The Meridian opened fire at 3:14 and 17 seconds. She fired with all 4 operable main battery emplacements in the first salvo. Her tactical officers had assessed that their 2 compromised emplacements needed additional pre-fire calibration, and had made the decision to lead with the 4 that were clean rather than risk a degraded first strike across 6. 4 primary emplacements, heavy-yield plasma, targeting 3 of the lead Vreth encirclement vessels and one of the closer command ships at distance. The firing solutions that weapons had been refining for 22 minutes were, by any standard I have seen applied to first engagement targeting, exceptionally precise. The first salvo crossed 1,100 kilometers in 3.4 seconds. The sensor returns from the strikes were immediate and detailed. The Meridian's tracking systems were optimized for exactly this kind of assessment, and the damage evaluation that began coming in within 10 seconds of first impact told a clear story. The 3 encirclement vessels had been struck simultaneously. 2 had taken critical damage to primary structural integrity. 1 had lost propulsion capability. The command ship at distance had taken a partial strike. 1 of the 4 plasma bolts had found it at the edge of its firing arc, and the return showed significant damage to its communication array, but the vessel itself was still maneuvering. The Vreth response was 9 seconds. 9 seconds from first impact to their initial return fire, which was, by any operational measure, a disciplined response to an unexpected engagement by a force that had not been prepared for this exchange. Their return fire was directed energy, high-frequency particle beams that our pre-contact spectral analysis had flagged as probable weapon-class emissions, now confirmed in the most direct possible way. They targeted the Meridian first, which was logical, and they brought 3 beams to bear on our forward section almost simultaneously. The Meridian's armor held. She was built for this. Her forward section was layered armor with an energy dispersal matrix that our engineers had spent considerable effort optimizing specifically against directed energy weapons, and the first Vreth salvo found that armor and was distributed rather than concentrated. The damage control board lit along our forward quarter with a series of structural alerts, and I felt the hit, felt it as a deep concussive shudder through my station, through the deck under my feet, through the air. But the Meridian did not stop and did not slow, and her second salvo was already cycling. The destroyer Cormoran was at point position in the escort formation, 280 kilometers off the Meridian's starboard bow. She was a vessel of 340 meters, and she had a crew of 64, and I had met her captain, Commander Lena Orens, at a fleet briefing in the 2nd month of the mission, and had found her precise and careful and quiet in the way of people who think carefully before they speak, and who speak less than they think. At 3:15 and 8 seconds, the Vreth concentrated a second beam salvo on the Cormoran, rather than continuing to target the Meridian, because their tactical assessment had correctly identified the destroyer formation as the primary threat to their encirclement geometry, and the Cormoran was the exposed point of that formation. Her armor did not hold. The sensor return showed it cleanly. A return signature that had been the Cormoran at 315.07 was a debris cloud at 315.11. 4 seconds. The Cormoran and her 64 crew and Commander Orens, who had turned her ship onto an attack bearing toward the nearest Vreth encirclement vessel in the 2 seconds between the first Vreth salvo and the second, went from a clean sensor return to a debris signature in 4 seconds. The CIC of the Meridian registered it the way CICs register things. The Cormoran's tactical identifier changed state on the plot from blue to gray. There was a moment, not long, a few seconds, where the room absorbed this in the particular operational silence that military people use to process a loss without stopping. Then the watch officer's voice came up, steady, calling the status of the remaining formation, and Admiral Cray moved the patrol cruisers into the gap the Cormoran had left. I was recording. That is what I was doing. I want to be honest about this because I think the role of the intelligence recorder in a combat situation is easy to mischaracterize in retrospect as something more active than it is. I was sitting at my station, and I was annotating my record, and I was watching the plot, and I was watching the faces of the officers around me, and I was noting what I saw with the particular detached precision that my training had spent years building into my professional habit. And I want to say that in the moment that the cormoran's identifier went gray, my training held and my recording hand kept moving and my voice annotation kept going. And I want to say equally that this did not mean I did not feel it. I did not know Commander Oren's well. I knew her face and her name and the single impression of precision and quiet that she had left on me from one briefing. It was enough. Admiral Cray ordered the second wave launched at 3:16. 2 full wings of attack fighters, 112 aircraft, going out in strike packages of 8 targeting the Vreth forward formation. The flight deck had been staged since 2:48, which meant that the launch sequence was moving before the debris of the first exchange had fully registered on anyone's consciousness. And the tempo of it, the rhythmic vibration of catapult cycling, the deck temperature variance that you feel when large numbers of aircraft leave the ship in rapid sequence, overlaid the operational noise of the CIC with something almost mechanical in its regularity. Warrant Officer Adisa had his deck running at the pace his training and his crew made possible, and that pace was extraordinary. The fighters went for the flanks of the Vreth forward formation at maximum acceleration, forming their attack packages as they cleared the Meridian's defensive envelope and beginning their attack runs before the Vreth point defense systems had fully reoriented from the capital ship exchange. The doctrine that the Meridian strike group was executing had been developed specifically after the Third Passage incident. It was called the layered pressure doctrine in the tactical manuals, and its basic logic was that a superior numbered force, facing simultaneous threats at multiple vectors and ranges, cannot optimize its response to any one of them without creating exploitable gaps in the others. The Vreth forward formation was facing the Meridian's main battery fire at 1,100 kilometers, the patrol cruiser's medium guns at closer range, and the fighter strike packages coming in at high speed from oblique angles. Their point defense systems were good. We had assessed them as good, and the assessment was accurate, but they were managing competing threats simultaneously, and the fighter losses in the first 2 waves, which were severe, came from that point defense capability operating at less than optimal coordination because of the simultaneous main battery pressure. 17 fighters did not come back from the first 2 waves. I have the names of those pilots in my personal records, which I copied from the casualty list that was assembled in the 72 hours after the engagement. I am not going to reproduce the list here, because this is not the appropriate document for it, and because each of them has a proper memorial record that handles that material with more care than I can give it here. What I will say is that the 17 who didn't come back went in on their attack runs at the same speed and on the same bearings as the ones who did, and the strike packages pressed their attacks on the Vreth forward formation with a coordination and a precision that I watched on the sensor plot in real time, and that I have thought about many times since in terms of what it represents, not tactically, but humanly. Between 3:16 and 3:19, the engagement entered what our tactical analysts later called the pressure phase, the period in which both sides had committed their initial assets and were discovering in real time what the other side's response to commitment looked like. This is the phase that is most difficult to convey in a written record, because it was not sequential in the way that a written account must be. It was simultaneous. The Meridian was absorbing damage and returning fire and launching aircraft, and receiving damage reports and issuing orders, and tracking the Vreth formation, and monitoring their communication traffic all at the same time. And the CIC was managing all of those data streams simultaneously, with the same professional constancy that I have described. And what this means in practice is that any attempt to narrate it moment by moment misrepresents the actual quality of the experience, which was not a series of discrete events, but a continuous operational environment in which many things were happening at once, and the people managing those things were doing so with a specific kind of focused attention that admits very little extraneous thought. What I can give you is the things I noted, because noting is what I was there to do. I noted at 3:17 that the Vreth forward formation had begun to adjust its geometry. The encirclement posture they had established was not static. It was a doctrine, a movement, and in the middle of the engagement, their remaining forward vessels were continuing to execute it, pressing inward despite the damage their lead elements had taken. This was either very disciplined or it was automated. Our analysts spent considerable time afterward debating which, but the practical effect was that the Meridian's formation was facing closing range on her port quarter, even as she was engaging the forward elements at 1,100 kilometers on her bow. Commander Rains at the tactical console flagged this at 317.23, and the Admiral shifted one of the patrol cruisers to address the port closure immediately and without apparent deliberation, which is the kind of decision that looks like reflex, but is actually deep preparation expressing itself at speed. I noted at 3:18 that the fighter strike packages were drawing Vreth point defense fire that was partially pulling resources away from the capital ship exchange, which was the intended effect of the layered pressure doctrine, and that the Vreth point defense systems were. This is the part that impressed me most, watching it in real time recalibrating. They were adjusting their coverage patterns in response to the fighter attack geometry. They were learning in the middle of the engagement that the doctrine we were running required them to cover a wider field than their initial configuration had allocated, and they were doing something about it. They were a good military force. I want to say so on the record, because I think the official accounts of the engagement tend to understate this in ways that misrepresent what actually happened. The Vreth forward elements, damaged as they were, did not collapse. They adapted. They were still killing fighters and still pressing their encirclement and still bringing fire to bear on the Meridian at 3:18, and the fact that we were making it cost them was not the same as them being stopped. I noted at 3:19 the Haldies. She was at the trailing position of the escort formation, holding the stern quarter against the possibility of Vreth units attempting to come around behind the Meridian, and she had been doing it competently and without any particular drama for the first 5 minutes of the engagement. At 319.14, 3 Vreth encirclement vessels that had worked their way around the port quarter, the same geometrical adjustment that Rains had flagged at 3:17, achieved a targeting angle on the Haldies that her own maneuvering could not fully address while she was maintaining her formation position. They hit her drive section with a concentrated 3-beam salvo that did exactly what 3 concentrated beam impacts on a destroyer's engineering section will do. It ended her as a mobile platform instantly and initiated a cascading power failure that the engineering crew could not arrest. The Haldies did not explode. She lost power, she lost drive. She began a slow rotation that she had no means of correcting, and her captain, a man named Ewan whom I had never met, had approximately 4 minutes to organize and abandon ship before the secondary systems that were keeping life support functional also failed. 41 of the Haldies' 68 crew made the rescue shuttles. I know this because the number is in my intelligence record, noted at 3:23 when the last shuttle confirmed away, and because I checked it twice. The engagement ran for approximately 15 minutes at full intensity from that point. The Meridian and her surviving escorts put 6 Vreth forward vessels out of the engagement, 2 destroyed, 4 reduced to minimal maneuvering capability, and the fighter strike packages drew enough point defense resource division to prevent the Vreth from reconcentrating their fire effectively on the carrier during the critical middle phase. The Meridian herself took 3 more significant strikes before the engagement pace began to change. One along her port side at 3:20, which opened a section of her secondary hull to vacuum and killed 11 people in the compartments adjacent to the breach. One to her communication array at 3:22, which degraded our tactical link with the patrol cruisers until the backup routing came online 40 seconds later. And one to her dorsal surface at 3:25 that struck close enough to one of the remaining main battery emplacements to require its crew to manually reset the targeting feed before it could continue cycling. Significant structural damage to her forward and port quarters, 61 dead aboard, 31 in the medical bays. The patrol cruisers and the surviving destroyers had taken lesser damage and were still fully operational, and the remaining fighter wings were flying defensive patrol patterns around the formation perimeter. At 3:29, the Vreth pulled back. Not dispersed, not fled, pulled back to 2,000 kilometers and held there, and the rate of incoming fire dropped from sustained engagement to nothing. Our analysts in the moment assessed this as formation reorganization. The Vreth forward units had taken serious damage, and the overall formation was reconfiguring to bring fresh units forward. That may have been partly accurate. What I noticed from my station in the CIC was the communication traffic from the Vreth command vessels, which had spiked dramatically at the moment the pullback order was issued. The traffic was dense and fast-moving, and our language models, which had been running in continuous mode since 3:12, were capturing most of it. The quality of the traffic was what stopped me. It was not tactical. In 15 years of intelligence work, I have developed a working vocabulary for the different textures of operational communication. Tactical traffic, which is dense and verb-heavy and organized around action and response. Administrative traffic, which is procedural and structured and concerned with logistics and status. Strategic traffic, which tends toward longer constructions and conditional language and the vocabulary of planning. What I was seeing in the Vreth command vessel traffic at 3:29 was none of these, and I flagged it immediately in my intelligence record, because the pattern was unusual enough to be significant. The traffic had the quality of interrogative exchange. It was asking questions. Not tactical questions, not the coordination questions of a force managing a live engagement. Questions of a different kind, using language structures that our models flagged as inquiry mode. A grammatical register that, in the Vreth communication patterns we had assembled over 3 weeks, appeared in contexts that we had provisionally associated with formal information seeking rather than operational command. Our models picked up 3 terms that were recurring with notable frequency in the command traffic during those 11 minutes. The first translated roughly as verify or confirm. The second was classification, which we had identified in our 3 weeks of observation as a term associated with the Vreth's assessment and categorization processes. The third, the one that Petrov pointed out to me at 3:34, turning from his console with the specific expression of a man who has found something that doesn't fit the category he was expecting, was a compound term that our models had not previously encountered in 3 weeks of observation. It did not have a direct rendering in our vocabulary. It took our translators several months to settle on a working definition for it, and the working definition they arrived at was a situation for which no existing precedent applies. Null record. In 3 weeks of monitoring Vreth communication traffic, extensive, detailed, operationally rich traffic from a fleet that communicated frequently and precisely, we had never encountered that term. We encountered it 11 times in 11 minutes, in the command vessel exchanges following the Vreth pullback at 3:29. 83 ships, 380 years of operational history, 41 previous contacts, every one of which had gone according to their established doctrine, and 12 human vessels in the Carrath Passage had produced a term that their operational vocabulary apparently needed to create on the spot. I documented this carefully, and I have documented it many times since, and I want to be clear about what I am claiming and what I am not. I am not claiming that the Vreth were frightened of us in any simple emotional sense. I do not know what the Vreth experience as fear, and I am not qualified to make that assessment. What I am claiming is that their operational framework, the framework they had used successfully for 41 contacts over 3 centuries, had encountered a data point it did not have a category for, and that their command apparatus was, in those 11 minutes, engaged in the process of trying to create one. What they were trying to categorize was not our weapons or our ships. They had seen weapons and ships before, and they were good enough at assessment to know that ours were capable but not categorically superior to their own in pure technical terms. What they were trying to categorize was the decision. The fact that when the Integration Directive arrived, and the arithmetic of 83 against 12 was plainly visible, the 12 had opened fire anyway. That had never happened before, not once, and the Dominion's assessment apparatus, refined over generations to produce reliable predictions about what contacted species would do when faced with the choice between compliance and resistance, had no record of it. I was watching all of this from my station, in the particular dual awareness of a person who is doing their job and simultaneously, in whatever mental space remains after the job is done, understanding what the job is showing them. The translation queue was running. The sensor plot was live. The damage control board on the secondary display showed the Meridian status in a language of amber and red indicators that I had learned to read the way you learn to read a familiar face, not by analyzing each element, but by taking it in as a whole and knowing what it means. The Meridian was damaged. She was standing. Both of those things were true simultaneously, which is not a condition that reduces to a single summary, and which I think matters for the historical record. Petrov was beside Admiral Cray at the main display, and I watched him during those 11 minutes more carefully than I watched anyone else in the room. Petrov had been doing intelligence work for 22 years. He had seen things I had not seen, and had worked through situations that I had only read about in case files. And in 2 years aboard the Meridian, I had come to regard his reactions as a reliable secondary calibration for my own. If he was flagging something as significant, it was worth looking at twice. During those 11 minutes, he said nothing unless directly addressed, and he stood in a specific posture, hands at his sides, weight slightly forward, looking at the plot, and the translation feed simultaneously, that I recognized as his version of concentrated attention. He was processing the same data I was processing. He was arriving at the same preliminary assessment I was arriving at, and neither of us said anything to the other for those 11 minutes. But when he caught my eye at 3:36 and held it for a moment without speaking, I understood that we had both noticed the same thing and that it was significant. The pullback lasted 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, the Meridian's damage control teams were working her forward section with the focused urgency of people who know exactly how much time they have and exactly how to use it. 2 of the 6 main battery emplacements were down, 1 from the direct strikes in the opening exchange, 1 from secondary damage, to a power junction that would need to be physically repaired before it could cycle again. The Cormoran was gone. The Haldes was a floating hulk with most of her crew aboard the rescue shuttles. Our port quarter point defense coverage had a gap that the surviving destroyers were partially filling. We had 61 dead, 31 in medical, and an unknown number of fighter pilots whose status was still being resolved from the engagement return data. Admiral Cray had not sat down once since entering the CIC at 2:48. She stood at the main tactical display, and she watched the Vreth formation hold at 2,000 kilometers, and she watched her damage reports accumulate, and she watched the communication intercepts scroll through the translation queue without comment. Petrov stood beside her for most of those 11 minutes, which was not his assigned station. His station was at the intelligence console 6 meters away, but which was where he was, which told me something about what he thought the Admiral needed in that period, which was not data but presence. At 3:40, the Vreth command vessels began transmitting on the contact frequency. Far translated. It took 4 minutes. When she looked up from her display and said quietly that they were asking us to stop, there was a moment in the CIC that I have tried many times to describe and have never fully managed to. It was not relief. We were not in a position where relief was appropriate, and the Admiral and everyone in that room understood that clearly. It was something more complex than relief. The particular sensation of having stood at the edge of a very long drop and looked down and not fallen. The Vreth transmission acknowledged that the Meridian group had responded to the Integration Directive with armed force. It acknowledged that this response was outside established protocol. It stated that the Dominion Command was requesting a cessation of hostilities, pending what it called a reassessment of contact classification. Farr noted, with the careful hedging of a person who wanted to be accurate about the limits of her translation, that the phrase she rendered as pending reclassification did not appear to have appeared in any previous Vreth first contact communication in the body of intercepts our models had assembled. It was a new phrase. They were writing new language to describe what had happened in the last 26 minutes. Admiral Cray read the translation twice. She looked at the plot for a long moment. She said, "Tell them we'll hold our fire. And tell them the Meridian group is not a survey party. Tell them we are a fleet asset. Tell them there are more where we came from. Make certain the translation is precise on that last part." What followed was not a peace, and I want to be specific about this because the official record's subsequent handling of the engagement has a tendency to present the cessation of hostilities as more conclusive than it was. The Vreth formation did not disperse. It held at 2,000 kilometers for the next 6 hours while we exchanged 4 further communications, each formally translated and formally replied to, each probing the terms of what had happened without arriving at anything that could fairly be called resolution. The Dominion wanted to know how many ships humanity had. We declined to specify. We wanted to know what the Dominion intended to do next. They declined to specify. It had the structure of 2 forces, neither of which was willing to be the first to look away, which is an uncomfortable structure to maintain over 6 hours, but which was, in the Admiral's assessment, preferable to either of the alternatives. The first formal diplomatic contact was 31 days later, by which time I had been transferred back to Fleet Command for the intelligence debrief that would occupy most of the following 8 months of my life. I know what was said in that first formal session because I read the transcript as part of the debrief process, and the part I have returned to most often is the opening of the Vreth delegation's remarks. Their senior diplomat, a rank that our translators rendered as first voice of the Integration Council, stated, before any formal exchange of positions or terms, that the Dominion wished to understand something. The question was, how long have you been capable of this? Admiral Cray's response per the transcript was delivered without pause, long enough. I was not in that room, but I have known Lenara Cray long enough to hear exactly how she said it, and I believe the transcript is accurate. The Carrath Passage engagement is officially designated First Contact Event 7 in the Fleet Registry. The Vreth Dominion remains classified as Contact Active, which is the designation applied to non-human powers with whom humanity has had armed engagement and with whom formal diplomatic process is ongoing. That process has been ongoing for 40 years, which tells you most of what you need to know about its progress. We are still talking. That is, by the standards available to us at the time of the engagement, the preferred outcome. I filed my complete intelligence record of the engagement on the 22nd day after it. When the acknowledgement came back from Fleet Command and the formal debrief process began, I sat for a while in the small office they had given me at the transfer facility and thought about what I had watched. I thought about the Cormoran and her 64 crew. I thought about the Haldies and the 27 who didn't make the shuttles. I thought about the 17 pilots whose names I was copying from the casualty list. I thought about Petrov standing at the Admiral's shoulder for 4 hours, which was not his station, saying almost nothing. I thought about Far at the translation desk for 22 continuous hours, reading new language in real time. I thought about Warrant Officer Addisa cycling the flight deck, with a regularity that I have never been able to adequately explain given the conditions under which he was doing it. I thought specifically about the 6 hours of standoff after the cessation of fire, those 6 hours during which the Vreth formation held at 2,000 kilometers, and we held our position, and neither side did anything except exchange measured formal communications and watch each other on passive sensors. 6 hours is a long time to hold a formation under those conditions. The Meridian was damaged, our casualties were being treated, and the damage control teams were working the forward section in suits because the section was partially vented. And all of that was happening in the same ship that was holding combat stations and monitoring a formation of 60-plus intact Vreth vessels at 2,000 kilometers. I have been asked whether the 6-hour standoff was tense, and I have always found the question slightly inadequate. The way questions are when the experience they are trying to describe is outside the range of normal vocabulary. The standoff was what it was. 2 forces that had just engaged each other with lethal weapons at close range, separated by 2,000 kilometers of space, deciding together and separately what came next. Whether that qualifies as tense depends on your reference frame. What I remember most about those 6 hours is not the sensor plot or the communication exchanges. It is the sound of the Meridian's ventilation system, which I was aware of in a way I was not normally aware of it, because, in the quiet of the post-engagement standoff, the ship's ambient sounds were more present than usual. The ventilation, the structural creaks of a hull that had taken multiple significant impacts and was still settling into its damaged configuration, the irregular sound of pressure equalization in the sections adjacent to the breached secondary hull. These were the sounds of a ship that had been struck and was still standing, and I found them, in a way I could not have easily explained to anyone who had not been there, reassuring. Not because they indicated safety, they did not, but because they were the sounds of continuity. The Meridian was damaged. She was making sounds. She was there. I thought about Petrov's expression at 3:34 when he turned from his console and caught my eye. Neither of us said anything in that moment, but I have thought about what we were both looking at, the null record term in the Vreth command traffic, and about what it meant from an intelligence standpoint. It meant that the Vreth Dominion, confronting for the first time a situation their operational record did not have a category for, had responded not by improvising and not by escalating, but by pausing to ask questions. This was, I eventually decided, a significant data point about the nature of the Dominion's decision-making structure. They were not an organization that defaulted to force when faced with the unexpected. They were an organization that defaulted to assessment. It had served them well for 41 contacts. It was serving them now, in the sense that the pause and the reassessment and the transmission at 340 were better outcomes than the alternative, for both sides. And I thought about the Vreth, about null record appearing 11 times in 11 minutes, about 41 species that had looked at the Dominion's fleet and made the same calculation and arrived at the same answer. About what it means to build a working doctrine on the assumption that rational entities will behave rationally, and to find, for the first time in 3.5 centuries, that you have encountered an entity whose definition of rational diverges from yours at a very specific and very important point. The Phase 2 debrief asked specifically for my analytical assessment of the engagement's significance from an intelligence standpoint. This is what I wrote then, and it is what I believe now. The Vreth Dominion entered the Carrath Passage with an operational doctrine that had functioned without failure for 41 contacts across 380 years. That doctrine rested on one foundational assumption, that when a smaller force is presented with an overwhelming one, it calculates the odds and chooses survival over resistance. It is not an unreasonable assumption. In the galaxy as the Dominion had experienced it across 41 contacts, it was a correct one. The species that survive to develop interstellar capability are, as a general pattern, the ones that balance ambition against prudence and understand that a fight you cannot win is a fight you should not take. The Dominion had built its integration process on that pattern because the pattern had been reliable, and it had been reliable because it was, in most cases, descriptively accurate. What the Dominion's 380 years of operational experience had given them no reason to account for was a species whose understanding of survival included a different calculation. Not the calculation of odds. We understood the odds. Every officer in the CIC understood the odds. But the calculation of what you become if you let those odds make the decision for you. What the Meridian did on the morning of the 14th was not irrational. It was a specific kind of rational that the Dominion's framework had no category for. The rationality of an entity that has decided there are things it will not accept regardless of the cost of refusing them, and that has built its military doctrine, its ship design, its training programs, and its command selection around that decision. The Vreth First Voice asked, at the formal contact session 31 days later, how long we had been capable of this. The question was about weapons. The question was about ships, about technology, about the specifics of our military capacity. But I have spent 40 years thinking about what was actually being asked, and I believe the question underneath the question, the one that produced 11 instances of null record in 11 minutes in the Vreth command traffic, was something different. It was, how long have you been the kind of thing that does this? The answer to that question is not one I am qualified to give. I am an intelligence analyst. I document what I see and I report what I assess, and I leave the larger meanings to people whose job it is to construct them. But I was there. I was in the CIC of the Meridian on the morning of the 14th, at my station, recording. I watched 50 officers hold their formation and return fire under conditions that most operational frameworks in the galaxy would classify as hopeless. I watched an admiral who had already spent most of her career making difficult decisions make one more, and make it in 15 seconds, and not waver from it for the 6 hours that followed. We fired, we held, we paid what it cost. That is the complete record. That is what the galaxy found out about us in the Carrath Passage on the 14th of March. I believe it was worth writing down precisely as it happened, and I believe precision is the highest honesty I can offer it.